What is a typical overhead in Japan?
日本
What is your overhead? Percentage-wise?
何パーセントぐらいと思われます平均して
Typical practice.
まあ普
What
通
percentage are costs? How much do you have left over? When I was investing a lot in research, my expenses were 85%. I put a lot back. So I didn't have a lot left. So I didn't have a lot to worry about sometimes. But first thing is to know what your income is. If I make $100,000 gross income, how much of that goes in my pocket? We used to, in this country, run around 65%.
アメリカでは普通65%ぐらいのもの
With large practices, usually you'd run about 65% overhead. It's not very often I hear of anybody below 50% that's really doing a good job. Okay, so you do have profit. Now what are you going to do with it?
でそれをどうするかという話です
Sooner or later, you should get your education paid for. Any debts that you accumulated, for instance, when I started, I was $100,000 in the hole when I started. It took me 10 years to get that paid off. So I'm still paying my education for the first 10 years. We have to depend upon our own welfare. And we have to plan ahead. Now, your needs here. What about family, home, education, your social club, your entertainment,
ですから
your
自
vacation?
分に教育
Finally, then, you
ま
have
た
to
やるとかい
determine
ろいろあります
what kind of excess you really have after your living expenses. So here's another. And a lot of times, what we think is excess isn't. Once you have this, is it going to be speculation, or you're going to get into speculation, or you're going to get into something that's highly blue chip kind of an investment? Very risk-free. Gambling is bad business. And people gamble in business investments just the same as they go to Vegas.
なことをやるというのに似てると思います私もやったことがあります
Why? Because it was exciting and I thought there was a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. I lost $300,000 in one investment.
一回で
We always talk about successes. We don't admit failure, do we?
ですから
Now, one of the things that we have to think about is the hidden costs, inflation, and taxes.
それ
How much profit do you have if you're running 65%?
ですかコスト
It's
があった場合
35%
どれぐらいの基準というと 35%
In the Carter administration, how much inflation did we have in the United States? How much was it?
誰か覚えてる方いません
15%.
15
All right, I start a case and I give a fee. I'm only making 35%. Inflation eats 15% this first year,
それでその初年度はその
15% second
あ
year.
の
I've lost all but 5% in 2 years.
ね、そうしますか
Now
実
suppose
益
my
が
patient goes
5%
3 years.
でどうしましょうか
I'm paying them to come into the office.
そうするとも
Y'all see?
うそういう計算をしてるんです
Now, a lot of people don't particularly like me getting into all of these personal things at the beginning of a course.
まあけど
But if you can't make money, you can't stay in this business.
ないんです
And being efficient and doing the things the way we do them was an actual necessity. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk a little bit about, and I realize we're about out of time, is probably the thing that's most dear to my heart of anything that I've ever done. In 1962, as I said, I was on a panel dealing with motivation. I gave the paper, a lot of requests were made for the paper. I sent out the paper to a few people. But I realized something was missing.
しかし
The following year, I was on my way to down in Florida, and I went through Denver and for my usual visit there
でその
to
時に
Rocky Mountain. And I was given this book by Mr. Brucey. This book is called The African Genesis.
アフリカンジェネシス
You can see that I've used it quite a bit.
という本なんですけどもかなり
It was written by a man by the name of Robert Ardrey.
Who's this again?
Ardrey,
What did he
A-R-D-R-E-Y.
do? I'm sorry, I wasn't
It was written by him, Robert Ardrey.
ロバート・ア
I came to know him very well because I made it a point to meet him. I was lecturing in Italy and he lived in Rome. So I got his number and called him up on the phone. Told him how much I admired his work. This was, of course, years later. What he did in this book was to attempt to talk about the physical anthropology, behavioral anthropology, and interpret it in the terms of modern culture. He was trained as a playwright. Any playwright has to be a good psychologist. He also minored in the natural sciences. If we were to study Freud, he said that man was driven by these four needs. The need for survival, food, the love and care of progeny. Now these are the only four drives. When I was a student in college, taking my courses in psychology, this is what I was told that were the drives of the human. And he said that there was only these four. So any motivation, any drive, any need of the human, if it couldn't be put in the first of these three, had to be put in the fourth one. Now what's the fault with that?
What's the what?
Fault. How did that get society into so much trouble? Because we're talking about 50 years here of frustration in the field of psychology. Now the problem came with Freud was that he studied all of the animals in captivity. So in his first book, The African Genesis, he said there are four more drives that have to be identified, that drive and motivate. Remember I said motivation. That motivate people, that drive and make them do things impulsively, instinctually, and the first of these was territory. A wolf or a dog urinates on the tree. What's he trying to say? He's trying to say, that's my tree. A bird gets in and starts singing in the top of the tree. I've already got this territory, you get your own. Man also needs territory. He needs something to own himself. Look at what is happening in communism today. It's falling. Because people want private property. They want to have something that's their own. They want freedom because that is a part of territory. Now the next thing that we don't have to learn is that we orient to a society. The next thing then, even within that, we want to have a status. All of you people have a great deal of status already, or you wouldn't even be here. You had to get through high school, get through college, get through dental school, get some orthodontic training, and then get in the Bioprogressive study club. There's always those who are satisfied at a certain level. People who want to achieve, the achievers, have to have a higher status. The last drive, he said, was the will for order, or the will to abide by the cultural standards. Even the criminal has his code. And of course, there were so many new ideas in it that he was ridiculed, derided, put down, and said that he was worthless. Particularly by the psychologists who had built their whole idea on the first four of these Freudian. And he began to be invited in groups of anthropologists. He had spent several years then moving to Europe, situating himself in Spain, where he could go and meet with Eliot Howard, who was studying birds in London, and get to know personally what he called the three wild men of Africa.
He got to...
Three wild men of Africa.
What about them?
Getting to know them personally. This was Leakey,
それがリーキーと
broom,
ブルームと
and dart.
この
You also got to know Konrad Lorenz in Germany,
それからドイツのロレンツとも知り合いにな
where a
り
lot of the work in the natural sciences were made. He then went back after another 5 years
でまた
and deliberately chose territory. Territory.
このテレ
And
ビ
he
で
wrote this book, The Territorial Imperative. The Territorial Imperative. So he went back and reviewed a lot of the basis for his previous ideas, came back and gave due credit to Freud. But in the last chapter here,
これを書いて
I consider the most brilliant of all of his writings.
これは
It's entitled The Three Faces of Janus.
Three Faces of Who?
Janus.
ジェニス
Janus.
ジャニスジャニス
Janus.
説明します
Ancient Greek culture,
これ古代ギリシャの文化に
they had a god called Janus.
魚がいました
Yeah. Janus had two faces,
でした
and people would put it above their doors of their homes. One face facing inward, and the other face outward. He was called the god of the beginnings.
この
The face inward with the beginning of your life in your home when you came through your door. The one facing outward would be the life that you have, the beginning of your life when you go outside your home. It's where we get the word January for the god Janus, the god of the beginning. Now he said that there were three faces to it,
ところの顔を持っている
and that these three faces represented the three drives and motivations that we have in our life.
でこの
Now, with this, you have a better understanding of man and his needs and his drives and methods of his motivation. Okay, now here they are, and remember them,
これをぜひ覚えておいてください
because they are also in a hierarchy. The first need that you and I and everybody has is identity.
まず
What does identity mean? You do not understand it until you understand its opposite or its antithesis. Its antithesis is anonymity.
で愛という
I talked about status, didn't I?
さっき社会
What is status? Being somebody.
ステータスというのは何でしょう誰かで
What
ある
is recognition?
で認められ
Being
ているのは
somebody. We need to be told and reconfirmed that we are somebody, that we are important.
あなたは重要な人です
Self-respect, self-worth. What have I been talking about? I just love you. Ooh. Oh, you're a good guy.
なんていい人で大事な人だということを繰り返し言ってもらうことが必要です認めて
I love you too. We need it. We need to be told that we're loved. We need to be told that we're expected. Little things. Little things.
小さいことでいいんですでも
We
人に認めら
all
れなきゃ
need
いけ
it.
ないんですこれが必要です
If we don't, we lose hope.
そうしないと希望がなくなってしまいます
We shoot ourselves.
それはもう自殺行為です
Look at the record. We go out and try to find identity in places where it doesn't exist in the right way.
今まで例えばそのアイデンティティを自分のアイデンティテ
It's
ィ
all
をつけよ
there
うとして
in his book.
違うところを
That
使
is
ってい
the
ます
first thing that we all need. What is the most beautiful thing that you can do? Remember a person's name, isn't it?
それは
Why is their name so important to him? Gosh, he remembered my name.
患者の
He must think I'm important enough for me to remember his name.
あるいは人がてくれた
Human characteristics, human needs.
感
That's
激
what
して
it's
くれ
about.
ますこれはもうヒューマンニーズです
Now I'm thinking of motivation, 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 motivation.
これはもう
It's the secret of successful orthodontic practices.
お
In
成功
many
する鍵です
ways, many ways.
いろんな
And it has to come from here.
で本当に心か
You
ら
just can't put it on.
上っ面だけではダメです
Now the second thing is stimulation.
二つ目に
So stimulation is the second thing that we need.
二つ目に我々人間として
Where's
必
the
要なのは
action? I want to be where the action is.
刺激です
So what do we need? Orthodontic office should be a fun place.
でここでですから我々が
And
必要
I sing I tell stories, I dance, I'm having a good time when I'm treating patients. Why? If I can't have a good time then, when am I going to have it? That's all I do. Yeah. Now the last need we have is security. And its antithesis is anxiety or fear. Life is very, very simple this way. Every patient sitting in your chair has those three fundamental needs, and that's it. They want to be somebody important. They deserve respect. They deserve recognition. They're a human being. No matter what age. The little child says, "Mommy, let me do it." Isn't that right? What do they say that for? That's me. I don't want somebody doing that. I deserve to do this myself. That's me. That's my identity. That's a part of my growth. Stimulation, parties, groups. And we want security. We want the security of not having problems. The fear of not having. Okay. Every time I've given this first day, it's been different. I've given this 2-week course over 100 times. And it's never been the same twice. The whole idea today, the motivation behind everything that I have said today, is to get to you to reason that there is a patient behind that set of teeth that you're straightening. You're treating a whole person. Maybe a little person, but it's a whole person. And this is what you have to keep in mind. Not only is it exciting, but it's pleasure. Because you get a lot of rewards from a patient when it's done properly and done well. If there's one joy I have, it's going down the street and having a patient that I treated many years ago come up and grab and give me a hug. Gosh, you did so much for me. And that's the ultimate joy. So if you understand now how to motivate, understand what people's needs are, it puts you in a position where you can control, you can plan, you can organize, and you can be a leader. Not just in your office, but a leader in your whole community. So that's the essence of this idea of social science. I don't know where to put it anyplace else, but if you're going to make a science of it, it has to be in the social sciences. But I think this is what Engel was talking about when he wanted to know what kind of a person he was training. That he had to have the heart. He had to have the fundamental interest in doing good. Otherwise he felt he was wasting his time. It's very interesting to me to meet people that I had trained maybe 10 years ago. And it's very interesting for me to get their answer. Very interesting to hear their answers. After they had 10 years to think about the 2 weeks that they spent, they remember the first day. God, you taught me how to think about the whole person. You taught me how to think about being a complete person myself. I had one woman came up to me in one of the hallways in one of the national meetings. I had my badge on. And she looked and saw it was Ricketts. She says, "Are you the Dr. Ricketts? Are you the one from California?" I says, "Yeah." She came up and put her arms around me and got tears in her eyes. She says, "You don't know me, but I want to thank you for what you did for my husband. He has never been the same since. He's been a better orthodontist, but he's been a better father, and he's been a better person since he spent 2 weeks with you." That was a joy to me to realize that I had had an influence on his life, on his family, on his relationship with his wife, and so forth and so on. Now then, where does the word philosophy come in? When we say that you practice bioprogressive philosophy, we mean that you are integrating a group of principles. And these principles become your beliefs. And they are what you stand for and what you think that you can do. They're based on possibilities, probabilities. And as I said yesterday, we'll be talking more about feasibility. So a bioprogressive philosophy, very simply, is an integrated body of principles that are applied to a clinical regime. Okay. In 1972, I had a class just about this size. It was made up of a group of unusually bright students. So I said to this group, now you've been here for 2 weeks. Now, what are we going to call it? So then I realized that I was doing things in sequences, sort of in a progression. And so I thought, well, let's call it the progressive technique. But more than that, it was the seeking of things that needed to be done first. One of the students then, when I asked what are we going to call it, his name was Tom Christie. He spoke up and said, we have been talking about that. And we think that everything you do is biological. We would like to have that idea reflected in what you call it. So on the spot I said bioprogressive. We looked around at all the rest of the students. Now today we're going to start talking about the biology and why it came to be associated with progressive. Biology, of course, simply means the study of life. I suppose this general idea is one reason that I have been a little hesitant about accepting typodonts to use in the course of orthodontic treatment training still. The literature was done by Paul Simon of Berlin in about the time of World War I. And he talked about it as the norm concept. The dictionary describes as norm, meaning a standard or something that is a rule from which to compare other things to. A norm then becomes a rule. We'll talk a little bit later about the 4 ways that we can determine what is normal. But this norm concept came into being as a result of some of the thinking that went on in the 1920s. Cephalometrics as a tool means simply measurement of the head. Cephalad is, of course, toward the head. Caudad is toward the tail. So metric is a way of measuring things with the meter scale. Now, during those years also, there was a lot of people believed that you could, with orthodontic appliances, move the parts of the face with impunity. That with bite plates and with inclined planes and with mandibular posturing devices, you could make a mandible grow. So if the mandible was back, very simply, you brought it forward. But there are a number of problems that were associated with this. One being is that you didn't have a way of monitoring what took place. But when things happened, you didn't know whether they were due to natural growth or whether or not you were the one that did it with your treatment. Why don't we accept Ponce Index today in the United States or most of the institutions here, even though it's taught in many parts of Europe? Was taught, I don't know what the present state is, but it was taught up until recently, I'm sure. The limitations of orthodontics are not in the maxilla. They're in the mandible. And to set the maxillary teeth up first and then try to treat the lower to it is biologically backwards. We can split a palate. We can move the maxillary teeth much further and much easier than we can move the mandibular teeth. So biologically, it didn't hold up. So in harmony with that idea, Simon proposed what he called an orbital canine law.
提唱しました。
He had the Frankfurt plane,
まずフランクフルト平面を使いま
and he
す。
dropped a perpendicular from orbitale.
オルビターレから垂直に線を引きます。
And he said that the canine should be located somewhere on that line. And he was objected to by Milo Hellman.
それ
And Hellman's objection was the fact that the canine has to lie in a reciprocal position. Reciprocal. Well, we have what we call in maritime reciprocal trade laws.
そう
Reciprocal means fair to both sides. So the word reciprocal means simply that the teeth have to be positioned with regard to both jaws, not just one. Now, let me see if I can discuss another piece of work that was done later by Solo in Copenhagen. Solo's first principle was that the mid-sagittal cranial base has no bearing on the relationship of the jaws. So he said then, his first principle was that the deflection of the cranial base is a non-determinant factor in malocclusion. It did have something to do with the opening of the nasal airway. So it did have something to do with breathing space. So we're going to be looking biologically in this area. I'm trying to get the idea of biology to you. Here is the posterior nasal spine, and here's basium. Now imagine then these two being pushed together
この2つがこう一緒に押され
with a
て
cranial base that's
接
going to
近す
be
るとします。
more acute.
そうすると当該点はもっ
So that's
と
going to restrict the airway
きつい
space.
角度になってしまいます。そうすると気道が狭くなります。
If I have a lot of convexity to the face and a patient with normal occlusion, the lower incisor is forward reciprocally. Now, if I have a concave face,
逆にこのくぼんでいる顔面の人、
the lower incisor may hold the same position
化学摂取は同じ位置を
relative to that plane.
その平面に対して維持するわけです。
So I called it the reciprocal denture plane.
私はこれをレシプロカルデンチャープレーン、相反的なデンチャープレーンと呼んでおりまして、これ私いくつか
Therefore, what do you relate the lower incisor to? Where it should function dynamically.
ダイナミック動的な形できち
You
んと
understand? Now, then the upper incisor
次に上顎
is
接
related reciprocally to where the chin is. Now let's look at the molar teeth.
次に大臼歯
If I have a very narrow maxilla and a wide mandible,
逆に広い場合
I've got a crossbite.
クロスバイタになります。
But to get those two teeth together, I've got to move these teeth out, move these teeth in a reciprocal position
でこの上顎と関
to harmonize between those two jaws in the transverse plane.